Hello, my fellow professors there in Poland. My name is Professor Christian Esguerra. I teach journalism at the University of Santo Tomas here in Manila in the Philippines. I've also been a practicing journalist for the past 2 decades. And the topic that I'm going to discuss for today is, of course, one of the topics that I've been also talking about, or writing about, or reporting about in my career as a journalist. I'm talking, of course, about the Philippine US alliance. Now, for this discussion, I decided to frame this in the context of a rather complicated relationship between the Philippines and the United States. This relationship actually is better understood, or should be better understood, in terms of the location of the Philippines in the Asia Pacific region. A lot of experts have been saying that the Philippines enjoys the benefit of geography in the sense that it is strategically located in this region. At the same time, it also has a curse of this particular location, a gift of nature, so to speak, in the sense that if you are a world power who would like to establish your foothold in this region, it would really make sense if you would try to gain alliance with the Philippines, if not gain control of the Philippines. And in this day and age, at this time, of course, you know that China is the second biggest economy in the world, a rising power, an undisputed regional power in the Asia Pacific region. And somehow, of course, you know that China is posing a very serious threat in terms of American influence, not just in this region, but in the rest of the world. Now, the Philippines plays a pivotal role in terms of this relationship between the United States and China, and this will be part of the discussion later on in this lecture. Now, it's also very important to go back in history and how this relationship between the Philippines and the United States started. We go back to the Treaty of Paris in 1898, which basically uh, contains a very important provision wherein the United States was able to gain control of the Philippines after Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Now, this particular move by Spain should also be seen in the context of how Spain back then lost control of Puerto Rico, of Guam, of Cuba to the United States, and all of these developments were covered under the Treaty of Paris. Now, the start of the American occupation in the Philippines also signaled the end of Spanish occupation, which lasted for more than 3 centuries here in the Philippines. So you can also imagine the immense influence in terms of culture, in terms of religion, in terms of education, in terms of governance by Spain toward the Philippines. Now, here came the Americans occupying the Philippines as a new set of colonizers, so to speak. Now, that didn't sit well with a lot of Filipinos, although there was a good number of Filipinos who also supported the United States. Many of them were tired of fighting, having to fight the Spanish government, the Spanish colonizer, and here again having to fight the new set of colonizers, in this sense, or in this case, the United States. But a good number of Filipinos at that time actually stood pat on their conviction that the Philippines should not be anymore placed under the control of another colonizer, another power, which in this case, of course, was the United States. So the occupation of the United States of the Philippines actually triggered a Philippine American War. Now, in terms of history, this is considered as one of the bloodiest episode in Philippine history, where thousands of Filipinos and also Americans died in the process in a protracted battle waged mainly through guerrilla warfare, because we know that the Philippine soldiers at that time were quite ill-equipped, and the context of this is that the Philippines, soon after Spain lost control of the Philippines, took advantage of that situation by declaring independence. But that declaration of independence was short-lived, and the Americans actually ignored that altogether, and they established their own government here in the Philippines. But of course, later on, they were also convinced, because of intense lobbying, because of intense campaign by Philippine nationalists, by Philippine politicians, to set the stage for Philippine independence, and that actually was part of a process under the Commonwealth government, wherein there was this 10-year period during which the Philippines would be prepared for its eventual independence. But came another complication. In 1942, the Japanese forces, the Japanese Imperial Forces, uh, occupied the Philippines, and that somehow that actually halted the Philippines as the process toward independence by the Philippines from the United States. So from that episode of the Philippine American War, which was also tempered because of this because of the eventual engagement between the Philippines and the United States governments, that was actually interrupted fatally by the occupation of the Japanese forces by the Philippines during the Second World War. And here we saw what friendship between two countries could actually do, because the Philippines and the United States joined forces to try to stave off the occupying Japanese forces. But of course, it took a while before the United States was able to free the Philippines from Japanese occupation. But here you saw that there was intense cooperation between the Philippines and the United States when faced with a common enemy, who were at that time the Japanese forces. Now, the Japanese occupation was, or it ended in 1945, and also that was the time, of course, we know when the Second World War also ended. You have the Pacific conflict, primarily instigated by Japan, and of course, you know the history in Europe. The Nazi Germany was defeated by the Allied forces, and afterward, here in the Philippines, we had to face this very complicated problem of rebuilding after the destruction wrought by the Japanese occupation. The Philippines, mind you, was the second most destroyed city in the world at that time, after Warsaw in Poland. So there was a lot of rebuilding that needed to be done. Now, in the case of the Philippines, of course, we were expecting a lot of help coming from the United States, and of course, they came. Millions of dollars were infused in the Philippine economy in terms of aid, but of course, it came with a lot of conditions. We're talking here of parity rights or parity law that made sure that the United States citizens or American citizens would also enjoy the same benefits as Filipino citizens in terms of exploitation of resources here in the Philippines. So at that time, a lot of Filipinos found that quite unfair. The, Filipinos found that revolting, in the sense that we would not have been caught in this destructive war with the Japanese, if not for the American forces or the American presence in the Philippines. And it was only right for the United States to help rebuild the Philippines, which was destroyed because of that war, which the Philippines technically had nothing to do, as far as a lot of Filipinos were concerned. But that somehow illustrated how complicated the relationship between the Philippines and the United States could be, because it's very important to understand that even if the United States at that time was also trying to help the Philippines, it was also, of course, as expected, looking after its own interests. And given the immense disadvantage of the Philippine government at that time, we had to accept those conditions early on. Of course, later on, there was also an improvement when it came to that to those conditions set by the United States. Now, it didn't diminish the fact that the Philippines continued to occupy that very important place as far as the United States was concerned. The United States needed the Philippines for it to be able to make sure that its foothold in this part of the world would not be diminished even after the defeat of the Japanese, because afterward they had to face the growing threat coming from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics of Soviet Russia. So they had to make sure that the influence of the Soviet Union would be addressed by the presence of the United States in this region, and the Philippines at that time occupied a very important role, or performed, or had a very important role, to make sure that the Americans would be able to address this challenge coming from the Soviet Union. Now, In 1951, the United States signed a mutual defense treaty with the United States. 1951, remember that date. The Philippines is actually the oldest treaty ally of the United States in Asia. Some say it's Thailand, but technically, when you talk about security alliances, it's the Philippines that is considered as the oldest treaty ally of the United States in Asia by virtue of the MDT, or the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951. Now, this is a Cold War treaty between the United States, between Washington and Manila, to make sure that there would be a mutual assistance in case one of the parties is attacked. Now, one of the most important provisions in this treaty is found in Article 5, which says that an armed attack on either of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack on the metropolitan territory of either of the parties or on the island territories under its jurisdiction in the Pacific Ocean, its armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. Now, at that time, there was not much debate regarding this particular provision because at that time, during the Cold War era, that was quite clear. But in the context of the growing assertiveness of Beijing now in the South China Sea, a very important sea lane where the Philippines is also among the claimants in certain portions of the South China Sea. This particular Article 5 became quite contentious in the sense that can this also be interpreted to mean that if a Philippine vessel is attacked in the South China Sea in the disputed waters, let's say by China, would the United States come to the rescue of the Philippines? It took a while before the United States actually clarified this, and it remains to be seen whether this mutual defense treaty would actually be activated in case of an attack on a Philippine vessel, for example, in the disputed waters in the South China Sea. But during the visit of former President Barack Obama to the Philippines a few years back, he made this commitment by describing that the U.S.-Philippine alliance was ironclad. It's very strong, without necessarily somehow unequivocally saying that this particular provision would mean that an attack on a Philippine vessel in the disputed waters in the South China Sea would actually trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. But of course, later on under President Donald Trump, there came several other assurances that the United States would come to the rescue of the Philippines in case it's attacked, in the context, of course, of the South China Sea dispute. Now, in 1947, the United States signed a military bases agreement with the Philippines. Originally, that was a 99-year agreement between Washington and Manila that actually cemented the presence of the United States in the Asia Pacific region through the Philippines by virtue of this 99-year military bases agreement. But of course, in 1966, this particular agreement was amended and was reduced. The coverage was reduced from 99 years to 25 years, which expired in 1991. Now, at that time in 1991, that was a crucial moment in terms of Philippine American relationship or alliance because at that time, via slim vote, the Philippine Senate voted not to renew the U.S. bases agreement with the Philippines. And afterward, in 1992, the United States had no choice but to leave the Philippines and to close its bases, both the naval base and the air base here in the Philippines. So the United States had to look for another region, another friendly country to accommodate its bases. And one of those, of course, that stepped up was, of course, Singapore. But you couldn't, of course, underestimate the strategic importance of the Philippines. This actually signaled one of the most serious strains or complications in U.S.-Philippine relations after the U.S. military bases were closed down in 1992. And at that time, of course, the United States needed another agreement that would cover the presence of troops here in the Philippines because they had no choice. The United States needed the Philippines as much as the Philippines needed the United States. So then came the 1998 Visiting Forces Agreement, which governed the presence of the rotational presence of American troops here in the Philippines. This is very important because the Visiting Forces Agreement, even without a military basis agreement anymore between the Philippines and the United States, they needed an agreement that would govern the temporary presence of United States troops here in the Philippines. And this also, of course, governs the presence, for example, of the attendance of U.S. of Philippine troops in the United States. So why is this very important? Because, for example, during the military exercises between the United States and the Philippines held here in the Philippines, what if an American troop actually ends up violating Philippine laws? Who would have jurisdiction over that particular soldier? How would that crime would be tried, for example? And while the case is being heard, for example, by Philippine courts, who would have jurisdiction? Who would detain that American soldier? This happened already on two occasions, which somehow challenged the effectivity of the Visiting Forces Agreement. Now, the Visiting Forces Agreement under President Rodrigo Duterte is now under close scrutiny because last February, so February this year, President Rodrigo Duterte announced that he was actually terminating the Visiting Forces Agreement, which alarmed the United States because the United States knew for the fact that they need this Visiting Forces Agreement because otherwise another agreement, the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, would not actually be it would be very difficult to operationalize that without an agreement that would cover the presence of American troops on Philippine soil. But President Duterte decided to terminate the Visiting Forces Agreement, and according to the mechanisms under the VFA, you need to count 180 days from the termination, from the announcement of termination, from the official start of the termination before it actually takes effect. But just recently, President Rodrigo Duterte, in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, instructed his foreign affairs secretary, his foreign minister, to actually postpone the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement. And according to President Rodrigo Duterte, this 6-month delay in the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement can also be extended for another 6 months. It depends on what the president would decide to do during the period during which that is being postponed. Now, what was the primary reason why President Rodrigo Duterte decided to scrap this Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States? Officially, what he said was, on paper, he didn't say this, but this was also mentioned in some of the pronouncements by the president when he first announced that he was terminating the VFA back in February. He was actually angered by the decision by the United States to junk the visa of the former chief of the Philippine National Police, who is now a senator, Senator Ronald De La Rosa, who is among the closest allies of President Rodrigo Duterte. And Senator De La Rosa used to be the PNP chief, and as PNP chief, he was the main implementer of the brutal drug war of President Rodrigo Duterte, which, as we speak, using official records, has killed more than 5,000 alleged drug users or pushers. A very bloody campaign, and for quite a while, the main implementer of that particular bloody campaign was Senator Ronald De La Rosa, who used to head the Philippine National Police. Now, back in February, when President Duterte announced that he was terminating the Visiting Force Agreement, he cited the decision by the American government to invalidate the visa of Senator De La Rosa. He was actually angered by that decision by the United States. That's why he said, "I'm scrapping the VFA." Now, for us who saw or who heard that announcement by the president, that was quite flimsy because why would you actually compromise a very important agreement. Despite the many criticisms against the Visiting Forces Agreement, this is by and large considered as a very important deal as far as the Philippines and the United States are concerned. If you want to scrap it, you can scrap it, of course, but you have to cite a very legitimate reason, not a flimsy one, which in that case was the rejection or the denial or the withdrawal of the visa or the invalidation of the visa of one of the closest allies of President Rodrigo Duterte. Now, when the president decided to postpone the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement more recently, of course, we know for the fact that this was also driven by the fact that the Philippines, like the rest of the world, is still battling this coronavirus pandemic, uh, and of course, you have to somehow uh, make your priorities clear at this particular time. Now, it remains to be seen whether Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte would actually proceed with the actually terminating the Visiting Forces Agreement. That remains to be seen. We have to wait within the next few months whether the president would make good on his promise to terminate the VFA. But it's also important to understand the context uh, of the president's statements. We know that under President Rodrigo Duterte, the United States has been, or under President Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines has been getting much closer to China, and to the fear of a lot of people might be moving away from the United States. But if you ask the supporters of the president, for example, analysts who are trying to really understand what the president hopes to achieve here, they're saying that the Duterte strategy is actually something which involves a principle or a policy of equidistance, uh, being close to both the United States and China, friends of all, enemies to none. But it's also important to go back or to cite the previous pronouncements by President Rodrigo Duterte, especially when at one point he said that he's actually moving away from the United States and actually joining the sphere or the sphere of China under President Xi Jinping. Now that actually alarmed a lot of people, not just the United States, but also members of the military, members of the Philippine Foreign Affairs Department, and also members of the diplomatic community. And as with many of statements coming from President Rodrigo Duterte, his supporters usually needed to clarify many of the statements afterward. So in this case, if you talk with many of the diplomats, especially Filipino diplomats, they would say that despite the many pronouncements of the president against the United States, it doesn't necessarily follow that the Philippines is severing its ties with the United States, meaning there has to be an effort to distinguish between what the president says and what his people actually does. For example, if the president of the Philippines says that let's forget about the United States, I'm joining forces with China, I'm moving closer to China, it has to be seen in the context of actual action and paperwork, whether that is actually supported by actual movement, by action coming from the Philippine government. On many occasions, the engagement between the United States and the Philippines has continued uninterrupted despite this many pronouncements coming from the president. And it's also very important to understand the relationship of the Philippines in the context of the relationship between President Duterte and President Donald Trump. President Duterte has been openly saying that he likes President Trump. He has no problem with President Trump. And President Trump, controversial as he is actually someone who has been saying that on a personal level, he likes President Rodrigo Duterte. At the same time, President Duterte has been all praises for the president of China, Chinese President Xi Jinping. So here, it's important to see whether President Duterte is actually is he a fool, or is he a leader who has deep thinking in terms of the strategic importance of the Philippines vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the United States. Meaning, uh, President Duterte is being criticized by a lot of experts for his supposed lack of sophistication in terms of foreign policy, in terms of diplomacy. But there are also others who say that, hey, think about it. Perhaps President Duterte um is much wiser, much more sophisticated in terms of foreign policy than what his critics portray him to be. That remains to be seen because you can also somehow see this from the perspective that is the president actually sophisticated in terms of his foreign policy, or are we trying to read too much into President Duterte, when in fact there's no such thing as sophistication when it comes to his foreign policy? Now, this particular question, you don't expect to get an answer for this very complicated question in the coming, for example, in the next couple of years, in the next couple of months. It remains to be seen how this Philippine posturing under President Duterte would actually benefit or redound to or lead to the worsening of the Philippine position as far as, for example, the South China Sea dispute is concerned. But what is clear at this point is that despite the president's pronouncements against the United States, number one, he doesn't criticize President Donald Trump. And number two, despite President Duterte's pronouncements against the United States, the strong engagement between the United States and the Philippines has been ongoing in terms of assistance. Um, at the same time, we know for a fact that President Rodrigo Duterte has been closely aligning himself with China. Uh, of course, it remains to be seen whether this would actually translate into actual dollars coming in from China, because it's also important to understand how China thinks in terms of the region. The Philippines is also important to China, but how will the Philippines play its cards to benefit itself, and won't end up being used by the United States and China, two big powers, uh, where the Philippines is caught in between. That remains to be seen. So I hope this particular discussion was able to give us a better understanding of the complicated relationship between the Philippines and the United States, especially in the context of the Philippines' dispute with China here. Because the China, of course, we know, uh, aside from the second biggest economy in the world, is also uh, gradually increasing its presence, its influence, not just in Asia, but also in the rest of the world. So here, it remains to be seen how the Philippine-US alliance would actually affect China's growing assertiveness in this part of the world. So again, I hope that this particular discussion was able to give more clarity in terms of the complicated relationship between the United States and the Philippines. And if you go by the surveys, you would know that there's still a lot of distrust as far as Filipinos are concerned toward China. By and large, if you go by the surveys, if you ask the ordinary Filipinos, between China and the United States, Filipinos trust the United States more than they trust China. And whether that would change under President Duterte, whether the brief 6-year term of President Rodrigo Duterte would be enough to somehow change the landscape, or somehow tilt Philippine loyalties, for lack of a better word, more toward China, that remains to be seen. But of course, this can also be considered as a very stupid proposition, because Filipinos should be loyal to the Philippines. Filipinos, the Philippine government should watch out, should focus on their own interests, and that ultimately, in trying to engage with the United States and with China and with the rest of the world, Filipinos should not forget that their national interests, their own interests, should have primacy. With that, thank you very much for joining us, for listening to this brief lecture. And again, thank you very much, and I hope that this was able to give greater clarity as far as Philippine-U.S. relations are concerned. Thank you very much.